Welcome to the Business Talk podcast, where research meets real world impact. I'm your host Deepak. Let's get started. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Matthew Bidwell, the Xingmei, Zhang, and Yongge Professor of Management at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, as our distinguished guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Matthew's research explores evolving patterns in careers and employment with a particular focus on the rise of short-term, market-oriented work relationships and the diverse career trajectories emerging in today's labor market. His work has been published in leading academic journals and featured in prominent media outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times. Professor Matthew's scholarship has been recognized with numerous awards, including the Scholarly Achievement Award from the Academy of Management's Human Resource Division, the John T. Dunlop Outstanding Scholar Award from the Labor and Employment Relations Association, and the Scholarly Contribution Award from Administrative Science Quarterly. At Wharton, he is the multiple recipient of the Wharton Teaching Excellence Award. He has served as a senior editor at Organization Science and currently holds leadership roles as faculty co-director of the Wharton PeopleAnalytics Initiative and faculty director of the Wharton CHRO program. Dr. Matthew earned his PhD from MIT Sloan School of Management and Master of Science in Political Science from MIT and Master of Chemistry from the University of Oxford. In this episode, Professor Matthew Bidwell shares valuable insights from his research, post-COVID labor strategy, remote work, reorgs, and the new corporate reset. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Matthew Bidwell to the podcast. Professor Matthew, it's been an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Great. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
Professor Matthew, let's start with the big picture. How has the COVID-19 pandemic reshaped the relationship between employers and employees in lasting ways?
It's a great question. So before talking about the lasting impacts, I want to just talk very briefly about the transient impacts as well, because I think they've been pretty interesting, at least in the US. We tried to stop the economy and then jumpstart it again with huge disruption. And one of the things that led to here was what we call kind of the Great Resignation, like tremendous levels of job changing, which were really about just huge competition for employees, particularly frontline workers. And so we kind of saw a level of job openings we'd never seen before. We saw quitting like we'd never seen before. I think that gave employers a real shock. I think, we've been, if you look at the kind of the long sweep of history, or at least kind of the last decade, we came out of really a very stagnant labor market after the Great Recession. We kind of got used to employers having all the bargaining power. Post-COVID, we flipped to a situation where employees had enormous amounts of bargaining power because it was really difficult to hire. And so I think that has now died down. So kind of we're back to a world where it's not that easy to get a job. But I think it'll be interesting to see what the kind of aftershocks are and how once employers start to realize that actually you can't take having a workforce for granted, how does that change the way they think going forward? So I think that's one thing that I found really interesting to look at. The other huge change, obviously, is just remote work. And there it is hard to overstate how big the impact has been here in the US. I think there are some figures. The estimate is before COVID, about 7% of all working days in the US were being worked from home. Today, it kind of moves around between about 25% and 30%. And so it's quadrupled. Most office workers now in the US, according to surveys, work from home at least some of the time. So that's been a seismic shift.
Your research often highlights the rise of short-term, market-oriented employment. How has remote work accelerated or altered this trend?
It's hard to say. I mean, we haven't seen big shifts. So, I mean, one thing that you might look at is the rate of quitting. So how often people are moving jobs. Like I say, kind of the Great Resignation, we saw a big spike in this, I think mainly due to competition from companies to hire people. If you look at recent months, quitting is way down again. People are much less likely to be changing jobs than they were. It's hard to know what role remote work plays in this. you hear two sets of arguments. I think there are a lot of people who worry that remote work makes it easier for people to quit. They're kind of less attached to the company. If all I ever see of people is just kind of boxes on a computer screen, maybe I worry less about moving firms. And it's certainly the case that evidence suggests like your friendships at work are one of the big things that stop you moving. And so we can imagine remote work makes it easier for us to shift jobs. The other piece here that I've heard from a few people is it's easier to interview when you're in a remote job. Like before, you had to make up these excuses. Oh, I've got another dentist appointment, those sorts of things. So you kind of scuttle out of work during the day, go and interview. These days, if you're working remotely, it's very easy to interview. And so there's been some worry that it makes leaving work easier. On the other side, though, I think there are a couple of forces that really actually tie people to organizations more tightly. One is we're in a world where remote work is uneven. Some employers are very comfortable with it, other employers are much less so. If you're in a job that offers remote work, there's a lot of places you're not going to be terribly happy to go work for instead because they're not offering you those perks. So that might keep people in the job. The other thing is, I do think it's when you work remotely, it is harder to get to know your colleagues. And getting to know your colleagues is important for doing your job well. And so I think remote work makes it a little harder for people to integrate themselves into new organizations. And so given that, I might actually be more nervous about moving jobs if I was remote, knowing that integration process is going to be even harder than if I was an in-person employee.
Professor, many companies have undertaken major reorganizations post-COVID. What patterns do you see in how firms are restructuring and what are the implications for workers' career path?
It's another interesting question. I think what I've seen of the restructuring so far is a lot of it is more of the same. When you look at the announcements that companies are making, they're always talking about we're delayering, we're taking out middle managers. I slightly wonder why it's always middle managers that they're going after. I have two theories on that. I think one is middle management is where it's easiest to get bloat. Like we always think of new initiatives that we want to do, new things we want to try. We bring in more people for them that aren't directly linked to driving services and those sorts of things. So it may be that this is kind of the area where it is most important that companies every now and then do a bit of pruning. The more cynical side of me worries that we always go after middle managers because it's the easiest story to sell to the markets. A certain amount of this restructuring, I think particularly in tech, has been driven by, well, our investors think we're bloated, so we have to show that we're taking things seriously. I kind of feel like if you say, well, we're going to cut salespeople, the reaction is going to be, so does this mean you're going to do less sales? If we're going to cut kind of frontline delivery people, it's like, so you think business is going to dry up? But if you say we're going to cut middle managers, everyone's like, oh, fine, they don't really matter. I'm sure that this is all going to be okay. So I do slightly wonder whether that is driving quite a lot of this. I do think with the restructuring, so kind of you asked about kind of what they mean for careers. There's been a general trend, I would say, over the last 20, 30 years of this kind of delayering, this idea that whereas we used to have these kind of nice pyramidal bureaucratic structures, now we're moving to something that's much more fluid, kind of team-based, network-like structures without this kind of very rigid divisional system. I think that probably makes a lot of sense kind of as a business strategy. It's helped organizations become more agile, solve more complex problems, all of those sorts of things. It's been quite tricky for careers because I think the nice thing about that old pyramidal structure was it was very clear what the next job was. It was kind of the next one up. And I think in these delayered systems, it's much harder to figure out, okay, I've mastered this job. Now I want to go somewhere else. What do I do next? And so one of the interesting things talking to kind of HR people around different organizations is how much effort they're putting into trying to figure out how do we rebuild career paths, that we kind of took those career paths and we blew them up in the service of these kind of flatter organizations. But now nobody knows where they're going next. And I think a lot of people see this as a big contributor to attrition. They do their exit interviews and people are saying, well, I found this great opportunity somewhere else. And then the company says, well, you could have stayed here and done that. Why didn't you? And it's like, well, I didn't know that was what was happening next. Nobody really spoke to me about my career. And so I do think this restructuring has made career paths a lot more complicated. And I think it's been quite a challenge for a lot of organizations to figure out how do we present to employees, here's what a career looks like today.
Some leaders see remote work as a temporary fix, others treat as a long-term shift. From a labor market perspective, what does your research suggest about the sustainability of hybrid and remote models?
It's a big topic of debate. I certainly have one colleague who is very firm on the idea that remote work's a terrible thing and companies are soon going to get rid of it. I tend to disagree. I think that remote work is here to stay. Um, but I think, the debate around it often gets very polarized. You have a bunch of people who think remote work is great and the solution to everything. You have other people who say remote work is terrible. And I think in certain places it's kind of got swept up into the culture wars. There's some sense that remote work is too woke, and therefore has to be a bad thing. We're pampering our employees. Why can't people go back to work like they used to? I think it's better to see remote work in terms of costs and benefits, right? It's different. It clearly has some costs, right? I think coordinating your employees is a little harder. Um, I think we have a particular sense communications in remote workplaces get a bit more siloed. So we work well with our team and our manager, but there's less kind of broad interaction with other groups. I think there are very real concerns that it's harder to train people because a lot of learning is just watching other people, and it's harder to do that in the remote workplace. So remote work isn't perfect. But on the other hand, commuting is extraordinarily costly. In a lot of big cities, people might have a commute of an hour plus. People are spending 2 hours a day commuting. Well, you can live with a lot of inefficiency if you're going to give people back 2 hours a day. And so I think that is a tremendously powerful force in favor of remote work. And I kind of think that's what happened during the pandemic is we had always assumed that that commute was just the price you had to pay to work. And then we all started working from home and realized we could get our stuff done from home. And I kind of think you just can't unsee that. You can't go back to a world where it's just like, sure, I have to commute every day. And so I think in most organizations, we've reached a point where it starts to be a negotiation, right? Which is, I realize my employees like the flexibility of working from home. I realize they like the efficiency in many ways of getting to work from home. As an employer, that creates certain issues for us. And so, where are the compromises? Where are the win-wins? How do we find ways to maximize the benefits, minimize the costs? I think that's where we're going to end up. Like I say, in the US, the trend over the last 2 years has been for kind of an infinitesimal reduction in remote work. And so you read all of these headlines all the time about, remote work is dead. It's all about return to the office. You look at the statistics, you just don't see that. And I think that's because in most organizations, they realize it has benefits, it has costs. We need to figure out how to make it work rather than just saying, we're not going to do this.
Professor, has the shift to remote work reduce or increase inequality in career advancement opportunities, particularly for early career professionals or underrepresented groups?
So another excellent question. I think the effects on inequality are really complicated. One thing, remote work has tended to be enjoyed most by underrepresented minorities, by groups that have tended to suffer in the workplace. So mothers, in the US, we talk about the gender pay gap, but it's really a motherhood pay gap that, huge amount of kind of the differences that women face in the workforce are to do with motherhood. mothers, working mothers, have been some of the people who've most enjoyed being able to take advantage of remote work because it gives them a little more flexibility. It really helps them to manage the conflicting demands of the workplace and home. And so it's been great for them. Um, there's also a lot of evidence that underrepresented minorities have disproportionately taken to remote work. The story there, as I understand it, is that if you feel if you feel less of a sense of belonging in the workplace, you're kind of concerned about microaggressions, you just don't feel that you fit in, which is the day-to-day experience for a lot of minorities, that's a less comfortable place to be. If remote work gives you a little distance, allows you to kind of not experience that the whole time, it's more comfortable. And so we've seen underrepresented minorities as well, taking a lot of advantage of remote work. And so on the one hand, that's been great. It's helped organizations track different populations, help to integrate them into the organization. The thing that worries me is, at least pre-COVID, most of the evidence was that being in the office meant you had a higher chance of getting promoted. There still is, even with remote work, something of a FaceTime culture. There is, I think, if you are in the office, you are probably erroneously, but you're still kind of seen as being a bit more committed. We know that networks and relationships are really important in careers, and it is easier to build those in person. And so yeah, we haven't seen a lot of research on this post-COVID, but I would still place my money on the people who are in the office more having a bit of a leg up when it comes to career advancement. So my big worry is that remote work has had both made it easier for some of these kind of marginalized groups to be part of the workplace, but may have placed an additional barrier to their advancement. I think the other aspect of it that you mentioned was kind of early career professionals. This, I think, is, yeah, like I said, I'm generally positive about remote work. It's like, why make people commute if they don't have to? I think the group where the benefits are most questionable is early career professionals. We do have a strong sense that people learn from being around other people. And as an early career professional, you're just not getting the same exposure to senior people. There's some evidence on this. Yeah, I think you mentioned one of my roles. I'm the faculty director of our program for chief HR officers. I remember the chief HR officer for a private equity company early on in the pandemic saying she thought that the analysts who they were hiring out of investment banks were about 6 months behind where she would expect them to be in terms of their development because they've been working from home, because they weren't getting this kind of training. It sounds plausible. I always worry slightly. I mean, it is a law of nature that young people are never as good as they used to be. And so how much this is just generally, we always complain, oh, the youth of today are terrible. But I think given everything else we know about how people learn, it sounds plausible. And there have been survey studies that find people report spending less time mentoring when they're working from home, spending less time being mentored when they work from home. And so it's interesting, I kind of feel like for employers, I'm like, you should figure out how to make remote work effective. It will enable you to attract and retain better people. For employees, if you're ambitious, you probably want to be spending a bunch of time in the office because ultimately that probably is going to be better for your career.
Professor, how are internal labor markets, the practice of promoting from within, being reshaped in this new environment? Are firms still investing in long-term career development?
Yes, they are, and I think they'd be crazy not to. It's interesting when we started, you kind of talked about I think the frame a lot of my research around kind of the rise of more kind of short-term ways of working, kind of the decline of internal labor markets. I will say my thinking on that has changed over time, and probably to some extent since I last wrote my website blurb. I am fascinated by that. The big challenge with that interest is it's getting increasingly historical. when you look at what's happened in the US, you did see during the 1970s and 1980s, early 1990s, kind of this abandonment of corporate loyalty. This was going to be much more market-like. I think during the period since the 2000s, since about 2000, if anything, we've probably seen a slight pendulum swing back towards internal labor markets. Like everybody thought, why are we bothering with all these structures when we can just go out and hire the people we need? And then everybody discovered that actually going out and hiring the people you need was much harder than they thought it was going to be. It can be hard to find good people. And even if you can find them, it's a real struggle to integrate them into the organization. It takes a surprisingly long amount of time for people to really become effective in new organizations. And so I think pretty much every company that I talk to, how do we build a strong talent pipeline? How do we promote from within is a really important question for them. It is interesting to think about how remote work affects that. One of the things that you see is it makes the internal labor market kind of broader and deeper. Kind of pre-remote work, we're thinking about who in this office can take this job. Post-remote work, increasingly, we're saying who throughout the entire company can take this job. And so I think it's opened up a lot more opportunities in large multinational organizations. I don't think we're talking about gig work quite as much as we used to.
Professor Matthew, what role does organizational culture play in this new corporate reset? And how are companies managing the tension between flexibility and cohesion?
That's a big challenge. I mean, I think when you talk to CEOs about why don't they like remote work, um, they'll talk about productivity. We don't think people are productive. I've never seen any very good evidence on that. I mean, there've been a few studies on productivity. They're all over the map. So they talk about that. They do talk about culture a lot. I think the worry is if we have people who are rarely in the office, rarely around people, how do they learn about our culture? How do they really get a sense of who we are and what's different about us? And I'm sure that's true. Um, the counterpoint, though, I think, is that how you manage remote work is now part of your culture. And so when we talk about what our culture is, it's how we treat our people, how people expect to be treated, all of those sorts of things. And our attitude towards flexibility is part of that. And so I think it's very hard as an organization to say, our culture is all about ownership and empowerment. We expect people to behave like owners of this organization, to take responsibility, to really step up. We empower them. It's about their decisions. We trust them. We give them autonomy. Oh, and we expect them to be in the office every day because otherwise we don't really trust them to get their work done at home. I mean, I think when you yank people back into the office, you're making a very strong statement about where you think that balance of power lies, about how much you respect people's autonomy, all of those sorts of things. And so I think this is a difficult thing. There definitely is some truth to the fact you need to be more deliberate about building your culture in a remote and hybrid workplace. But I think you also really need to understand what you're doing to your culture when you drag everybody back into the office.
How do workers pursue the trade-off of remote versus in-person work in terms of autonomy, visibility, and career progression?
I think it depends a lot on what you're after, where you are in your career, what matters to you. Uh, if your goal is to be promoted as fast as possible, to make as much money as possible, I would probably recommend spending more time in the office than most other people. Like I say, you build networks that way. There's a lot of evidence that relationships matter in advancement. There's a lot of evidence, particularly that what we might call bridging relationships matter. That it's not just that I know all the people around me, I know some people that the other people around me don't know. It's those kind of distant relationships to other groups that mean that you know what's going on faster than other people. those are really important to advancement. And those are a lot harder to build in a hybrid world. And so I do think there is likely to still be a significant career edge for people who are in person more often. But we balance that with all of the other things that we have going on in our lives. And so I think at any stage in your life, what's really important to me? Is it that? Is it flexibility? Is it autonomy? Is it the experience of being home? What am I trying to do right now? And I think that's the balance everybody has to strike for themselves.
Looking at labor market churn, are we seeing more job hopping and gig style transitions as a new norm, or is there settling down post-COVID?
Definitely settling down. So in the US, it's a nice survey called JOLTS, the Job Opening and Labor Turnover Survey, that surveys companies every month about their levels of quitting. Levels of quitting are quite low at the moment. People are talking about a frozen labor market where people aren't being fired, which is a good thing. So kind of layoffs are down, but so is quitting. Like employers don't want to hire new people. They want to hang on to the people that they've got. People can't get jobs, and so they're not moving otherwise. Like I say, I think if you go back into deep history, right? If you look at the period from 1970 to 2000, then you do see this move towards kind of more short-term employment relationships. But that's not the story since 2000. So since 2000, it's really been a cyclical story. So during booms, we move towards shorter term employment relationships because people can go find better jobs. During times when the economy is a little softer, it's hard to find jobs and everybody stays. That's where we are today.
Professor, my last question. If you were advising CHROs today, what key element would you emphasize in crafting a resilient and equitable post-COVID labor strategy?
I hope I've given some sense kind of some of the complications of doing it. And I do think you don't want to think in binaries. I mean, I think it's so tempting to either go like remote work is great and it's the future, or remote work is terrible and we need to do everything we can to stop it. It's got benefits, it's got costs. And so I think it is trying to find some of those win-wins. I think for CHROs, a lot of it is about bringing the organization with them. At least the CHROs I talk to, it's amazing how many conversations on remote work basically start with, well, my CEO believes that we're not as effective working remotely. And then the conversation is, yeah, but we also keep telling the CEO that if we give up on hybrid work, we're going to lose lots of people. How do we negotiate that? And so I think finding ways to get the whole organization thinking about in a more nuanced way about this. And with this, I'm always a huge fan of data. You know, we all bring our prejudices to work, our beliefs based on our own kind of our own recent interactions. Getting people in front of, here are the facts, here's what we're doing at the moment, here's what we're experiencing, and helping to use that to craft a slightly more thoughtful approach that gives people autonomy where we can, but also brings people together where necessary. That's where I would be thinking.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for today's episode. It's been an honor to host Professor Matthew Bidwell from Wharton. We have explored key insights from his impactful research on post-COVID labor strategy, remote work, reorgs, and the new corporate reset, a topic that continues to shape how organizations and individuals navigate work in the post-pandemic world. Professor Bidwell's deep understanding of labor market, evolving employment relationships, and organizational change offers a critical lens on where work is heading. His scholarship and leadership have not only advanced academic thinking, but also informed real-world HR and organizational strategy. We are grateful for the time, knowledge, and clarity he has shared with us today. Thank you, Professor Matthew Bidwell, for joining us today. We truly appreciate your time and commitment.
Thank you, Deepak. I'm very grateful to you for inviting me on this. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks.
Thank you.